What is public theology? How can the church move from not only doing theology within the context of the church in the academy, but to also do theology that benefits the common good? And how can we do public theology when the church in the Western world is suffering from a serious credibility problem? In this podcast, we're going to answer these and other questions. Stay tuned. This is the podcast for Multi-Faith Matters, and I'm the host, John Moorhead, and I'm happy today to have as a return guest, Dr. Ted Peters, and I'll read some of his bio here. Ted Peters teaches systematic theology and ethics at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. He co-edits the journal Theology and Science at the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences. He's the author of God, the World's Future, Systematic Theology for a New Era, and God in Cosmic History, Where Science and History Meet Religion. He is co-author of Evolution from Creation to New Creation. Along with colleagues, he has edited Astrotheology, Science and Theology Meet Extraterrestrial Life, as well as Astrobiology, Science, Ethics, and Public Policy. Ted, welcome back to the podcast.
John, it's good to be with you once again.
Well, in the past, you and I discussed the fascinating topic of UFOs and astrotheology.
One of my favorite topics.
It is mine too. We're not going to delve into that today, but you recently did a blog post looking at public theology, which was fascinating. And one of the links that you posted was to an article that you wrote, and this will all be in the program notes for folks to seek out. You wrote an article in the International Journal of Public Theology titled Public Theology, Its Pastoral, Apologetic, Scientific, Political, and Prophetic Tasks. And that is just a great piece there. And I'm hoping that through some of our conversation today, we can kind of tease out some of what public theology is and its significance for the church and for outside of the church. Obviously, it wouldn't be public if it was just for the church. But to begin, how did you come to develop an interest in and see the significance of public theology?
In large part, I've always been a theologian of culture in the tradition of Reinhold Niebuhr, Paul Tillich, and Langdon Gilkey. And even though they didn't use the term public theology, they were speaking from and to the wider culture. And if you think about those theologians between the two world wars and right after the Second World War, peace and whether or not America should get involved in the war, these were unavoidable issues. Could you bring the resources of systematic theology to bear? And of course, anthropology is the big one. What's human nature? Can we predict violence, etc.? And I went to the University of Chicago, and that's where this kind of theology of culture was very much alive. That article that you just mentioned in the International Journal of Public Theology is my manifesto, so to speak, what I think the public theologian should be responsible for.
Could you define public theology? It might on the surface seem like, well, it's just theology for the public, but it's a little more complex than that. How are you defining it, and how does it relate to other spheres in which the church does theology and perhaps maybe more comfortable and used to doing theology?
Public theology, as I see it, is conceived in the church. It's critically honed in the academy, and then it's offered to the wider culture for the sake of the common good. And those are the three publics that my Dr. Vater at the University of Chicago, David Tracy, had identified, and we need to conceive it in the church where we have the resources of scripture and tradition and theology and critical intellectual thinking, especially when the church overlaps with the university. etc. But then it's offered to the world. Hopefully, the theologian has got some insight of value for somebody outside the church. When it's offered for the world, it's offered in the name of the common good. Critics of traditional religion are usually critical because traditional religion looks sectarian, selfish, institutionally selfish. So it's very important that it's the common good, inclusive of all peoples and actually inclusive of the ecosphere, that the public theologian should be contributing to. And it should be obvious that the public theologian is concerned about the common good of all of us.
This might seem like another obvious definitional question, but I've gotten some pushback at times from those when I talk about the need in the context I work in to pursue forms of multi-faith encounter that work through difference for the common good. And the pushback is, well, what common good? I mean, come on, we have to do what we have to do for the betterment of the church. Otherwise, we're compromising our mission. How are we defining common good?
Well, I think you've got two issues there. One is perspectivalism, that is to say, oh, we don't have a common good because we have multiple perspectives. And then you can accuse anyone of talking about the common good as having his or her their own perspective, and therefore it's impossible to be common. I believe in transcendence, and I'm going to go back to Plato rather than the Bible. Justice is transcendent, goodness is transcendent, truth is transcendent. We all can judge anything that is perspectival according to these transcendental verities, it seems to me. And our different religious traditions, whether they're Asian or Western, have a version of reliance upon transcendent standards for evaluation. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that it's impossible for people of different traditions and perspectives to agree on the common good. Justice is the measure of every injustice. And John, you've had enough experience with people of different religious traditions. They don't have any trouble if they're in the room together agreeing on what justice is, do they? And so it seems to me that the common good is not that difficult to arrive at. In addition, when I think about corrupt politicians, of which we have a lot these days, notice none of them will say in public, I am a selfish, racist bigot and I want to steal money from the working class. They don't say that. Oh, no. They say they are in favor of justice and equality and things like that. But then they blow this little dog whistle. Even the crooks have to appeal to the same common good that people of goodwill do.
Yeah, since you mentioned politicians, and I think it's the same thing can be said in religious contexts and Christian contexts. Perhaps the concern, the issue isn't that we can't define and recognize the common good. It's that we're too polarized and tribalized that only my tribe is concerned for the common good. The other may say they are, but they're really just looking out for their own self-interest. Is there any merit to that idea?
I I find this puzzling. On the one hand, if you think of economic self-interest, those who have bought our congressmen, congresswomen, and senators who have bought them, petroleum industry and military contractors, etc. You can say, well, I do understand why they purvey lies ad infinitum, but what about this marriage between evangelicals and the Republican Party? Evangelicals don't have a financial interest, And evangelicals, as important as the pro-life position is, you can't reduce the evangelical gospel to that one issue. So I am puzzled about why we do have that polarization. Now, we know historically that it was a deal between Jimmy Swaggart and Ronald Reagan to deliver the evangelicals for the Republican vote. But that's 40 years ago. Why haven't things changed? And why don't the evangelicals stand up with some level of moral integrity? I have to say, John, I'm just puzzled. I'd like to know, do you have any observations you can help me with?
Well, unfortunately, I think there's been it always comes across in the language of faith, but I really
Yeah,
think there's been a conflation of faith identities and political identities. And unfortunately, at least on the right, many times political ideology is the primary contributing factor, where there's no ability to sit back and think critically let their faith tradition critique the political
that's
ideology.
right. That's so important, and that's what's missing in this polarization that you described.
In one of the many interesting things you write about in this journal article is you talk about that the public theologian contributes one voice among many. And at one point in the blog post where you're talking about it, you write, there is no global choir, no unison, no harmony, only cacophony. So the question that comes out of that is, how does the public theologian contribute something to this that will seek to serve the public good and be heard by as many as possible?
Well, the point with there's no global choir is there's actually no authority that everyone listens to in any field, whether it's religion, politics, economics, arts. Maybe the scientists have a slight edge up on the rest of us, but even science has undergone over the last 10 years the threat of fake news and pseudoscience, etc. So, pluralism is simply the order of the day, and anyone who wants to speak publicly, a theologian or other, must accept the pluralistic setting, which means we can't rely on the authority of the Bible, we can't rely on the authority of the Pope. We have to be one voice among many. So, if we're going to get heard, I think two things obtain. One is that we need to speak for the common good, and I believe the common good will automatically draw people of goodwill to want to listen. Um, then, secondly, what the public theologian says needs to be rational, reasonable, persuasive, not in the sense of trying to make converts to your ideology, but in the sense that there's wisdom here. And I do believe the Christian theologian, and this can be true for other religious traditions as well, have gained wisdom over the centuries about human nature. And one of the things that appears in ideological conflicts is sort of a denial or a naivete about human nature. And it would seem to me that people of great religious insight could contribute those insights to the public discourse and raise the level of shared understanding about the human condition. And all that's reasonable. It's not sectarian. All of that is reasonable, and it seems to me that's it's idealistic in the sense, oh, maybe people will just shut us off. Well, okay, but on the other hand, why be quiet? John, in some ways, you and your podcast are trying to do exactly that, are you not?
Yeah, definitely. It seems to me that one of the challenges for conservative Christians, particularly evangelicals, is the assumptions about what the common good needs. Well, they need to get saved, and therefore this is an opportunity to be evangelistic. And you're arguing that this is not the context. So might the biblical passage to everything, there's a season, right? There's a time and place for everything. And when it comes to trying to be a public theologian, that is not the context in which to be evangelistic. It's time to wear another hat and pursue another course. Would that be correct?
You say it very articulately. That's good. I mean, I believe that the evangel, the gospel of Jesus Christ, is very important. It makes people's lives better to experience God's grace and to live out of God's grace, and that is such an important mission of the Christian church. There's no question about it. However, taking off that hat, putting on the other hat with regard to the common good, you're right. We don't want people to automatically suspect, and when engaged in public theology, that you've got a kind of secret proselytizing mission there. That loss of integrity really creates problems. Now, I'm a Lutheran. We have these two categories: the law and the gospel. And the law is universal. Every culture in the world has some intuitive grasp of God's law, that you love your neighbor and that you do justice, and compassion is a good thing. And in some ways, I'll say that the work of the public theologian is primarily the work of God's law. Now, the gospel is due to special revelation. What happened on the cross tells us that God is compassionate and forgiving. That's the special Christian message. There are times in which we have to wear our gospel hat as well. But the public theologian is primarily dealing positively in the domain of God's law, I think.
Now, this next question is going to make conservatives in my audience go nuts, but you mentioned the role of social justice in public theology. How is social justice not a dirty word? It's not something that is the sole purview of the left or the woke. It's been a part of the Judeo-Christian tradition for as long as it's been around. What role does that play in public theology?
Well, I think it's decisive for one reason, as I had mentioned earlier, looking at Plato, or Plato's gift to us, is justice is an eternal verity. And actually, you can get that in the Torah and the ancient Hebrew scriptures as well. It's said slightly differently, but God's justice judges your and my human failures at justice. And so there's no question. Again, the Lutherans call this God's law. The Lutherans are not alone, but it is universal. You don't need special revelation to realize that justice is a transcendent criterion by which we evaluate all human situations. Yes, since the Second World War, it has been the left side of the spectrum in both Roman Catholic and liberal Protestant circles to champion social justice. And I think this flag began to be waved with great vigor during the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, and has continued right down to the present day. And our liberation theologians are the ones that probably we rely on the most for doing this. I think a conservative is, if he, she, or they think about it, is just as concerned about justice deeply, and why in recent decades social justice has become the badge worn by liberals and progressives, and not a badge worn by conservatives and evangelicals. Again, it puzzles me. Justice is just as godly as love and compassion. So,
Yeah. I wish I had more answers for you. Your title in the journal article talks about public theology in a number of different ways. It says also in a political and prophetic task. How can we articulate a public theology in the political realm that avoids polarization and is also prophetic?
We had developing in the 1960s, and there are still residuals of it in liberation theology. We had developing political theology. And that political theology, which began in Europe and then spread to Latin America, began with an eschatological vision of God's kingdom. God's kingdom is a kingdom that's ruled by justice and love. And that provided the leverage, so to speak, to judge and evaluate our temporal kingdoms, our temporal governments, and the world order. And remember, that was a period of time in which decolonialization was taking place. Well, political theology has continued in kind of a wimpy form down to the present time. Public theology wants to include the best of that version of political theology, and that includes the prophetic leverage. And this is where the critical thinking of the university is important, because you can distinguish between truth and lies. And the first thing the public theologian needs to do, like every political theologian, is point out the lies that our leadership continues to tell us. It doesn't matter whether they're Republican or Democrat, we're getting lies all the time, and it's only worse in our period of social media. So I think the first thing of a prophetic nature the public theologian needs to do is to constantly point out lies, and then, as we've already discussed, measure current events according to the standards of justice.
Well, it seems to me in our present American political context that this task of the public theologian and being prophetic in a political context is not only outward for the public good, but also comes full circle back to the church, and the church needs to hear this prophetic critique of its own stance. Would you agree with that?
Well, the church is also a public.
Sure.
In the case of my church, which is the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, it kind of looks like American society. It looks sort of like the Democratic Party at prayer sometimes, but the issues of justice and truth telling and things are within the church just as they are within the larger society. So, yes, prophetic judgment needs to be rendered against the faithful as well. But what we can rely on within the church, at least I hope we can, is that the Holy Spirit will cultivate our values, our better angels, so to speak, and make us immediately proactive in this regard. Now, those are my hopes, and some days those hopes are fulfilled eminently, and other days I get disappointed. But you're right. The prophetic work within the church looks a lot like it does in the wider society.
Now, in America and the West, we now live in a post-Christendom context. I don't think we're post-Christian yet. The church still has significant influence on the way the culture thinks and does morality and these kinds of things, but certainly post-Christendom, where the church is no longer the defining center, and the reputation of the church in many quarters is suspect and damaged. How can we speak with credibility in light of our own credibility issues that we brought on
You
ourselves?
you were right, and this is really a dramatic point, is that we're in a post-Christendom era. The church no longer has authority, not even credibility. And because I'm a blogger and a poster, I get responses, and these responses are really nasty. They just horrible things are accused, religion is accused of, especially Christianity. So we're not in a situation in which the Christian voice is welcome. So that's one of the reasons that I'm pressing that I think the integrity of the Christian public voice is so important. Integrity, honesty, hopefully valuable insight, being rational instead of just simply vituperating. I'm hoping that these things will carry the day. There is no guarantee because rationality and reason and wisdom are not universally valued anymore. So it's not just a pluralistic society, but it's a society in which detractors of the common good have now got a heavy voice in terms of sponsoring division and contention, which then leads another task of the public theologian is constantly look for bridge building, unity, healing wounds, and things of that nature.
It might be helpful for listeners and viewers to share some examples of public theologians, maybe a few in the past, and any contemporary examples that folks can look to.
Contemporary examples. I think the best example are our echo theologians, theologians who are dealing on the basis of religious commitment with the health of the planet, the future of the planet. Celia Dean Drummond, Roman Catholic, I think at Durham in Great Britain, or Cynthia Molo Bida with me here in Berkeley at the Graduate Theological Union, who is a Lutheran. And then Rita Sharma, who's a Hindu Dharma scholar. I think of these people beginning with their religious commitment, but now dealing with the common good of the whole planet based upon their religious commitments, I think is a good example of public theology, even if they don't call it public theology. And then, of course, those who are passionate about racial justice. Again, that's for the common good of the whole human race and not just a religious denomination. In my Patheos blog on public theology, which you just mentioned, I occasionally will do an interview with a public theologian. So most recently, it's the public theology of Sharon Delgado, who is a Methodist pastor, and she has a ministry for the planet, the health of the planet, and that includes in her vision justice for Native American Amerindians in light of the oil pipeline, for example, going through their land. So you have to have local justice while you have a planetary vision of what the health of the whole is going to look like. So these are the kinds of people I think of immediately when the question of, well, who's a public theologian? Here are some examples. Oh, one more really important one. Hong Kong and Taiwan are two places in crisis. And I did one blog post, an interview with Kang Fi Seng, who is a public theologian, a Bartian, a Singaporese, but living in Hong Kong and teaching there, on the loss of freedom in Hong Kong as Mother China tries to return its children to the womb forcibly. And so there's a very specific contextual example of a public theologian, and he has a blog and he's out there marching with the students with regard to freedom of speech in Hong Kong and things of that particular nature. So you could call it political theology because it is that, but it's a public theology as well, not that there are two really different things.
Those are all very helpful examples, and hopefully folks will seek those out. I'm wondering what comes to mind for me in the context I work in. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Miroslav Volf at Yale.
You pronounced it correctly, yes.
Who does, as you know, the great work between Christians and Muslims that have this
Right.
historic animosity and this kind of a thing. So there are folks doing this kind of good work that needs to be done much more. Is there anything that I'm missing that you'd like to bring out and make known about this topic to the audience?
I think you've said it very well, John, just to repeat the two hats. I think the Christian does have a gospel hat in which we teach about the grace of God, the love of God, and the power of the Holy Spirit in turning a person around. That's the gospel hat. That's the church. That's the church's mission. But the other hat, what I call the law hat, is the one in which we speak to the common good of the wider culture without a hidden agenda that somehow would you and I could take advantage of. I think that's so important for working on that credibility problem. I think in the long run, integrity will be recognized and greeted positively. But in the meantime, I think the public theologian has to lead with integrity and a goodwill. So that might be my parting shot, John.
Well, we had a little challenge getting this scheduled, but I appreciate every time you come on the program. It's an exciting conversation, whether it is UFOs and astrotheology
Right.
or public theology. I want to thank you so much for being a guest.
Well, you keep up the good work of a public theologian there, John.
I'll continue trying. Folks, I want to thank Ted Peters for being here on the program. Please take a look again at the program notes. You'll find a link to his blog, to this journal article, and other materials. Seek out his work and find out more about what a public theologian is. To everybody who is watching and listening, thank you so much. Until the next episode.